You're listening to the Cyberwire Network, powered by N2K.
Your organization could be at risk due to common password sharing practices. Imagine this scenario. You're out of the office, a colleague pings you because they need access to some system that only you have credentials for. Now, of course, our listeners would never send a password over email or Slack. We know that. But what about your coworkers? How many organizations out there are sending logins back and forth in plain text? Worse yet, how many just store all of their logins on a shared spreadsheet? Now, we all know human errors are the biggest threat to your organization's security, but did you know that it accounts for over 68% of all data breaches? What you need is a platform that allows you to share credentials in a secure fashion, set access permissions or time controls, and monitor the dark web for stolen logins. Keeper Security Government Cloud is a zero-knowledge solution that does just that. Plus, it is FedRAMP and StateRAMP authorized. Want to see Keeper in action? Schedule a demo or request a trial today by visiting keeper.io/gov. That's keeper.io/GOV. And thank you to Keeper Security for sponsoring this episode.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
Looking to invest? Start your journey by exploring exchange-traded funds with Global X ETFs. Exchange-traded funds, or ETFs for short, create baskets of stocks, bonds, and other assets that you can buy in a single trade. Global X specializes in ETFs that track emerging trends, like the rise of artificial intelligence, as well as strategies aimed to generate income potential. Visit globalxetfs.com to discover how you can get started.
I say this a lot, and I truly mean it. We have world-class people, world-class organizations designed for a world that no longer exists. Mm-hmm. It's a big idea. Right. If we would understand the world we're living in and get out of our skiffs or buildings or wherever we are and spend some time outside, first of all, leadership's head would explode, going, what? I mean, mine does. Every time I find out, wait a minute, I could buy an iPhone crack or an Android crack for here, sure, and we were spending, N dollars inside of a building trying to solve X or Y. Well, why don't I just have and we kind of do.
Welcome to part one of our two-part special edition series with Steve Blank, adjunct professor at Stanford University and co-founder of the Gordian Knot Center for National Security Innovation. Now, Steve Blank is a well-known entrepreneur, educator, and author. He's the pioneer of the lean startup movement and creator of the Hacking for Defense program. Now, I wanted to bring Steve onto the podcast to talk about technology innovation and technology adoption to support national security. I specifically wanted his insights about how the Department of Defense has both effectively and ineffectively implemented technology adoption processes that might provide lessons learned to the cybersecurity industry. Here is part one of the two-part series with Steve Blank. I'm joined today by Steve Blank, adjunct professor at Stanford University and co-founder of the Gordian Knot Center for National Security Innovation at Stanford University. Steve, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So I want to start at a high level. You are a well-known expert and entrepreneur. You've written numerous books and articles on national security innovation. This is what you spend, it seems to be, the majority of your life and work doing. Can you give us a sense, where are we today? What is the state of play in national security technology innovation?
Well, I would separate out the two. What's the state of, innovation, and what's the state of national security, maybe adoption of innovation? Mm-hmm. And you have to put that in the context of, and what's the state of our adversaries and vis-a-vis the United States in national security innovation? Mm-hmm. I just want to remind your listeners something which might be obvious, but people inside the national security space are still having a hard time getting their heads around. It used to be that the U.S. owned all the technologies necessary to deter or win a war, right? Whether they were drones or cyber or autonomy or AI or ML or, semiconductors, et cetera. We owned it. Our primes owned it, our contractors owned it, our weapons labs owned it, University of Maryland or wherever else we went for cyber was the world's best at X or Y. That's simply no longer true for most of these areas. We still own some exquisite capabilities, whether they're hypersonics or nuclear weapons or exquisite sensors or capabilities or the ability to throw hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of people on a program and keep it black and whatever and put stuff in space at scale. But all the other core stuff we used to own now is like you could buy half of it on Amazon and the other half. I mean, we kind of predicted, with General Mattis, the world would be now 2 plus 3, Russia and China, and then North Korea and Iran, and still the non-nation states. Who would have thought the Houthis would have been, throwing and
a legitimate threat. I mean, to bring up that non-state actor.
Right. Well, obviously, they're not making that stuff. They're getting it from a regional, disruptor, which is Iran. Gee, that wasn't in the playbook, right? So what do? Bomb Iran? Well, maybe, but right now we're throwing SM-3 interceptors, a couple $1 million at $20,000 drones. Kind of insane. The same thing, like, again, I forget the name of the book I just read, but the fact that you could buy 0-day, breaks for a couple $1 million are now, I want to get into the latest iPhone, you no longer need to go to Fort Meade. It's an auction. Who would have thought that 10 or 20 years ago? It's like, what?
There's a market for that, right?
There's a whole market, and you kind of go, well, maybe we could lay off a couple of divisions at some of our agencies. Not that I'm suggesting that, but who would have thought that? My point, again, is that this notion of everything was owned by our national security establishment. And the point isn't that we've gotten stupider or whatever, is that a lot of this stuff has, become commoditized. And here's the big idea, is that our systems and organization, and more importantly, our acquisition organizations, there's an impedance mismatch between how we buy, how we organize, who we hire, and how we deal with the outside world and the organizations we've built. And that still hasn't kind of gotten aligned. And what's worse is our adversaries have done that. So, for example, both Russia and China understand that this is a whole-of-nation approach. That is, their economies and their military are aligned and interconnected. For us, you hear any agency say, well, the problem's money. We have it's a zero-sum game. And you kind of, at least I look at them and I go, no, the problem is it's a lack of imagination of where to get the money. How come we're not figuring out how to engage the folks who are already building this stuff or could be building this stuff with a set of incentives? And the answer is, and I'll stop here for the next sentence, I say this a lot and I truly mean it. We have world-class people, world-class organizations designed for a world that no longer exists. It's a big idea. If we would understand the world we're living in and get out of our skiffs or buildings or wherever we are and spend some time outside, first of all, leadership's head would explode going, what? I mean, mine does. Every time I find out, wait a minute, I could buy an iPhone crack or an Android crack for here, and we were spending, N dollars inside of a building trying to solve X or Y. Well, why don't I just have and we kind of do, but not. Think about it. Senior leadership grew up in a world 20 years ago. Right? And that world no longer looks anything like the world that and so you kind of get stuck with the things you knew when you were kind of coming up the ranks. When the world is changing at such a rapid rate, the older you are, the harder it is for you to kind of adapt and adopt. Not that it's impossible, but you need to understand that it's not just the rate of change, but the delta rate of change is increasing. Number of adversaries, number of capabilities, number of whatever. And, we could just focus on cyber, but we could talk about the national security space writ large is incredibly complex today. It looks nothing like it did even 10 years ago.
Sure, and that context matters, right? Because when we talk about whether it's cybersecurity or national security, the political context matter, the interstate competition matters. So when I think about what you just said in my own context, right? I spent nearly 10 years active duty in the Navy. The last 3 years of my life, I stepped outside of the building, and I've been in the private sector. And what I've seen is, from the outside, it looks like the defense world is refocusing to great power competition. You see that in their strategies. You see them kind of refocusing their efforts primarily to China. And it seems like a lot of the technology that they are pushing for the development of is focused on that threat from China. At least that's what the outsider in me is seeing. So I'm curious, from your perspective, what is the national security community getting wrong in terms of the nation-state adversaries, in terms of reorienting ourselves to the China threat and competition with nations like China?
I'm going to admit my bias, which, again, brings all kinds of baggage, but my professional career was an entrepreneur at Silicon Valley, where you operated with incredible speed and urgency, because there was a virtual gun to your head back then of running out of money before you could actually generate revenue. And so you would build things now we call minimum viable products. You'd ship them, you get feedback, et cetera. There was no notion of a JCDIS process or a POM process or, 2 to 3 years to get something into a POM that then you had to argue with some staffer who says it's, not in my district, and a congressman who has some political agenda. And again, that's the nature of the business. But that's not how the world operated in the world that a lot of these innovations are coming from. And that was fine when we were competing with another nation state like the Soviet Union that had the equivalent bureaucratic stuff. I mean, obviously communism worked from state planning and then a whole nother, but the clock speeds were essentially the same. The problem is that China, and if we just want to look at why this next statement is not bullshit, look at the number of DDGs, their destroyers they're putting in the water, or their ship count in the last 10 to 15 years. They've figured out how to operate at a different clock speed than we have. Period. End of discussion. And so the question is we could have lots of discussions of why we can't do that. But the other part that just flabbergasts me is that we do have a part of the nation that still knows how to operate in that. And those are the innovation clusters. And when I say Silicon Valley, I don't mean the physical place. I mean all the innovation clusters that know how to operate with speed and urgency and could be delivering capabilities to the DOD and the rest of the national security establishment. It's not that we don't do that as point things. So let me be clear. It's not that no one knows that it's here. But if you look at the list of what's called the MDAP, the Major Defense Acquisition Programs, which is basically the top tier 100 or so things that we spend billions or hundreds of billions of dollars on, there's not a single startup or scale up on it. And in fact, that list hasn't changed in the last 10 or 20 years since the consolidation of the primes. Well, that's a symptom of, we basically do innovation theater when we talk about adopting innovation at scale, but we really don't do innovation deployment at scale. And by deployment there are more demos of, hey, look what we have, shiny object C, Admiral, X or Y, or we show it to Congressman Z. And then you ask, well, how many ships is this on? Mm-hmm. Well, it's on one. Well, when does it get on the other 50? Oh, that's not really budgeted, or it's budgeted for 2045. Well, wait a minute. Don't we have a 2027 problem with the Taiwan Strait? Or gee, aren't we learning lessons from Ukraine? And so when are we deploying, drone stacks, let alone drone swarms? Well, we're working on it. Well, wait a minute. And again, and I know Bill LaPlante didn't really mean this, but when he says, the war in Ukraine is really all about artillery and not about innovation. Well, clearly it's a hybrid war. It looks like a combination of World War I, with trench warfare, with World War III, with drone stacks and advanced technology, and literally a meat grinder like World War I. And clearly, we need new factories for artillery shells, but also the amount of drones we attrit are probably as many as the number of shells we're attritting. And I'm saying that as obviously not exactly, but so us buying 1,000 drones a year is kind of silly when they're attritting 1,000 drones a month, if not a week. Right?
Yeah, at least, yeah.
So there's an impedance mismatch between, and the reason why I think, I've been spending time in large organizations, not only in the government, but in commercial companies, to understand why is this so hard to deal with disruption? Because in the commercial world, when that happens, it's kind of Darwinian. It's the creative destruction metaphor, is that companies, when new entrants come in or new technology shifts or cultural shifts, some adopt and adapt and others go out of business, and that's just fine. It's just fine. It's the nature of commerce. But if that happens in defense, we lose a war, we miss a technology shift, et cetera, that's the rise and fall of great powers. We can't afford to have that happen. And so we really need to deeply understand, why is it that senior leaders have such a hard time dealing with disruption? And the answer is pretty simple. Not the solution simple, but when you really go talk to senior leaders, what's hard about making massive changes? Well, if you make a massive change in a large service or a component of a service, what if you're wrong?
Right.
I mean, that was the argument about General Berger and Force Design 2030. It wasn't that he hesitated. In fact, people argued whether it was the right shift for the Marines, because he not only said we need to do X, but he also said we need to divest of a set of equipment, and that just panicked people. Said, well, you'll no longer be able to do mission X or Y. So number one is the disruption coming really a threat? And number two is, what magnitude of the threat is? What's the timing of the threat? And then what should my response be? That's the job of a senior leader, service chief, a secretary of defense, a head of an agency or whatever. At the same time, you got all these innovators on the bottom who are seeing the future, banging on the walls. But remember, between them and the senior leaders is a whole set of frozen middle. And by frozen middle, I don't mean that as a pejorative. That's another nature of large organizations. Large organizations are built by people and process. And you build process to have repeatable processes. You build doctrine, you build operating concepts, so there's not people randomly running around doing their own thing. We are focused on, this is the way we execute mission, this is the way we deliver analytics or pointy things or kinetic things, et cetera. But when change happens, that's hard to re-steer that middle because of two things. And these two things are common to commercial and government companies. One is something called the Semmelweis effect, which named after a doctor in the 19th century who noticed that women in his hospitals were dying in childbirth 20% of the time. Amazing. Yeah. And then he discovered that there was another hospital he was working in where that was only 1%. He said, well, what's the difference? It turned out the doctors in the 20% were doing autopsies in the morning and delivering babies in the afternoon. And he said there's something going on. This is before germ theory. So he now had some evidence, and you would think when he presented it to the doctors, they would have said, oh, maybe we should not do that.
Do the autopsies in the morning.
And of course, guess what? They ignored the evidence. They ignored the evidence for 30, 40 years. And we see that a lot. Not only do innovators come up with a shiny object, but the best of them create examples in actually operational execution. They actually run a new concept and get some evidence and put it in front, and people go, that's great, now let's go get back to work.
We'll be right back. The White House Office of Management and Budget deadline for federal agencies to adopt some level of zero trust architecture is this September 30th. Federal agencies must move away from perimeter security architectures towards never trust, always verify. Zero trust does not grant automatic trust to any user, device, or system. Every request for access must be authenticated, authorized, and continuously validated. Keeper Security Government Cloud is FedRAMP and StateRAMP authorized and ensures that users have complete knowledge, management, and control over credentials and encryption keys, all with a zero-trust security framework. Want to see how Keeper can help your organization achieve zero trust? Schedule a demo or request a trial today by visiting keeper.io/gov. That's keeper.io/GOV. And our thanks to Keeper Security for sponsoring this episode. I want to bring in and out just from my own experience, right, in the military, in this structure, as an action officer, one of those people at the bottom seeing the new technologies, new ideas, new ways of doing business. We called this, that frozen middle, we called it the brick ceiling. That we could talk to admirals all day and they would love our ideas, but the moment it got up to the commander or captain level, it would seem to kind of fizzle and die on the vine. And so that was my own experience, kind of seeing what you're talking about is very real. And it's not because they don't want to innovate. It's because they have other responsibilities, requirements, and jobs that they have to get done.
And I'll give you a way to solve this, or at least a possible way in a second. But there's a couple of other obstacles. And again, comment to commercial. One, as I mentioned, is the Semmelweis effect is unconscious. It's what human beings tend to do. It's not like there's malice involved or stupidity, even though it looks like malice and stupidity. It's really not. But the second part is conscious, and it has a little malice, and that's hubris. Gee, I'm a PEO. I manage $1 billion project. Screw you guys. I'm important. And it's all about my budget, my head count, whatever. And anything you do that threatens that, like I'm going to actively sabotage that. So that's another problem. The third problem, which is unique to the military, is even if you have a senior leader who gets it, who's in charge, they have a 2 to 3 year life cycle. That does not exist in the commercial world. In fact, the only example which over their dead body for the Navy will ever happen again was when Rick Overt created the nuclear Navy, right? He basically had a congressional support base that made him invulnerable. And boy, that was never going to happen again. Yet at the same time, and by the way, unique to the government is the fact that Congress is coin-operated. And what I mean by that is, if you're a prime contractor, you're smart. You put jobs in every district, your campaign contributions, if you're on the House Armed Services Committee or the House Armed Appropriations Committee, those are your biggest donors. And so when someone says perhaps we ought to delay or cancel one carrier, to buy 20,000 drones, guess what's not going to happen?
Or decommission 5 cruisers in the next couple years. And then Newport News says no.
Yeah, I'm not picking on the Navy. Pick, whatever weapon system we're talking about. And rightly so. That is the nature of our system. And if we don't understand how that works. And so let me give you an alternate universe. The problem is that if you go to the Pentagon and say, are we in a crisis? People will go, maybe, but, well, how long does the paperwork take to go from one side of the building to the other? Is it any different than it was like 3 years ago? And the answer is probably not in most cases. I mean, obviously, we have some programs that have been accelerated. But then you go out to the combatant commands. Go ask INDOPACOM or CENTCOM, are we in a crisis? Their hair's on fire. CENTCOM is shooting down drones on a daily basis. And INDOPACOM is counting the number of DF-21s and range of F-18s versus how far they got to pull the carriers back. And I mean, it's just a math problem. They're going what are you talking about? Well, here's the problem. We've not said, either from the president or the Secretary of Defense, we're in a crisis. Whatever we were doing last year, we can't keep doing. And we've not communicated that to Congress. We appreciate all the jobs and whatever, but the country is at risk. Not only is the country at risk from China or Russia, the country's at risk because the whole geopolitical chessboard has changed. Some of our actions have forced China and Russia and North Korea and Iran to operate as an axis of evil, but coordinated in a way that never existed before. And so we need to change how we operate. Yet, to me, it comes back is if you're in a crisis, you don't you don't appoint the same people you would have appointed when it was a process-driven organization, right? It's not that those people were bad, but the same people who know how to play golf are not the same people who are willing to walk through walls to make stuff happen. And the best, maybe visible example is people probably know about General Groves, who, along with Oppenheimer, built the Manhattan Project. Well, do you know what happened to him after World War II? Any idea?
I don't.
Eisenhower told him he was never going to get promoted again in his life because he pissed off so many people in the Army. Literally, Grove never got promoted him because this was the guy you needed in a crisis. And this was the guy. It's exactly what happened to Churchill, right? He was voted out of office when the war was almost over. Why? Because he was perfect for a crisis. He was a crazy person. Yeah. The analogy here is that there are a lot of great, and again, crazy people are the wrong answer, but a lot of innovators who will operate with speed and urgency, who need to be promoted or at least be allowed to operate as the number ones or twos in a crisis, who you would never want to operate in peacetime because they break glass, they piss off people, they stomp whatever.
They steamroll.
Steamroll, et cetera, which again is completely unacceptable in peacetime. And if we don't understand that distinction between, operating in a crisis versus operating in peacetime, we keep promoting peacetime, people and organizations and everything is calm. But on the other hand, incumbents have figured out how to sabotage and weaponize organizations to delay or stop innovation. So, for example, in the DOD, the primes have figured out how to weaponize the IG's office. There's no way that the head of DIU should have been investigated and the day he resigned got cleared, or there's no way the IG office should be investigating Replicator versus pick your favorite prime. So we've just figured out how those things have been captured to sabotage and delay for making the status quo continue.
Well, I want to ask, because this issue of allowing and encouraging and internalizing good disruption, this is not just a problem faced by DoD, right? Private companies face this too. This is why we have something called the innovator's dilemma. And so I'm curious, your perspective structurally, where these two worlds collide, I see is the primes that you were just discussing, the prime contractors and their interaction with the government. So where do the primes, what's their role in helping to drive innovation? I mean, they really have no incentive to do so, do they?
Well, not yet. So if we had, so let me break this down inside of the DoD and companies, and then bring in the primes as well. So if you think about it, that in peacetime and wartime, or in civilian companies, we need repeatable and scalable processes, right? And in the Army, we call it doctrine. Other services, operating concepts, et cetera. They need to be written down, people trained, et cetera. And we need very little deviation of that because we need operational excellence, right? And whatever our doctrine is, and for fires or intelligence or sustainment or whatever. And those processes need to be fail-safe. That is, lives are dependent on us following this stuff. But at the same time, we're not going to get any innovation unless we have separate organizations that deal with disruption. So think about not only the operating part, but also the development part. If you're developing a new gun or tank or whatever, people have built guns and tanks before, or
the Bradley fighting vehicle,
or fighter planes. I won't go into the F-35, but I mean, we should know how to do that. So here's the point: what goes in should come out, right? That is, there should be a one-to-one correspondence. If I've written a requirement and it should be on schedule and whatever, what goes in should come out. There should be very little failures if I'm managing those processes well. And by the way, that's innovation. That is, a next generation radar or moving Aegis from one platform to another. Yes, there are, but in fact, that's innovation around our core known standard systems or platforms. But there's a whole nother set of innovation that does not belong in those processes, and those are disruptive innovation. And I'll give you an example. using unmanned vehicles, whether they're ships or aircraft or ISR or mine clearing or mine laying or, take your pick of, or using cyber or using EW in a way that's never been used before. Well, those are actually disruptive things that create new operating concepts, but most of the things you want to do with them are going to fail. And so you need a different process that's safe to fail versus the ones that you're operating with, which should be fail-safe. That is, we need a parallel process that looks like a funnel rather than a pipeline, that where failure is not considered, oh, you failed, there's a congressional... That is, it's not an F-35 or a Ford-class carrier. It's a set of experiments that said, no, what will come out of that funnel is a set of tested things that have been iterated, tested, we figured out what the best was, and then we could actually feed them into the mainstream. Let me give you the world's best example of that.
Yeah, please.
And it's in the commercial world. It's called SpaceX.
Uh-huh.
And if you really think what SpaceX is doing, it's this. They have execution and they have innovation going on simultaneously. By the way, when you do both execution, that is sustaining innovation, disruptive, that's called an ambidextrous organization. That's a $20 word for being able to chew gum and walk at the same time, right?
I don't know anyone who can do that.
Right, no, chew gum and walk at the same time. And what I mean by SpaceX is, think about this. They're launching Falcon 9s every 2.5 days from 3 launch pads. Operational excellence. No deviation from like the checklist because there are human beings every once in a while on top of those, and they're launching Starlinks, and they had 300 or 200 before they had a failure in the second stage. I mean, just an incredible track. But at the same time in Texas, they have crazy people. They're building the next generation called Starship. And right. Elon's model was, if you're not blowing things up, you're not innovating. And more importantly, if you're not blowing them up on a regular basis, you're not innovating fast enough. They've now been through 3 generations of Raptor engines. Now, everybody understands in that company that today's paycheck is Falcon 9, but tomorrow's paycheck is going to be that Starship. And no one is jealous of each other because everybody understands execution pays your salary, but innovation pays your pension. And more importantly, those 2 groups are not standalone silos. They're talking to each other. The Falcon 9 people are reminding the Starship people, man, did we screw up where we put the ground surface equipment plugs? And when you build the next one, make sure their access panels are over here. And even though I said the Falcon 9 can't change much because it's operational excellence, the Starship people are reminding them, you could crank up that chamber pressure by another 100 pounds. And people haven't paid attention, but the payload capacity of Falcon 9 has actually gone up a couple of thousand pounds. Because they've been making these small little tweaks that have been tested elsewhere. So imagine that. So the DoD has components of this. We got R&D labs, we got whatever. I was going to say, don't we have DIU and Ensign and NavalX, AFWorks, software, all this innovation ecosystem? And more importantly, we have all these software R&D labs in every service. We have FFRDCs. But the clock speed and culture, and more importantly, the output for deployment are not connected. And they're not connected to match the threats. It's, again, not that we have dumb people or we're not doing pieces of this, but then you have to step back and say, great, given what's going on in the external world for innovation, what's going on in our labs, and we'll talk about DIU in a second, so how much of this stuff is being deployed? And then they'll say, look at this great demo. And you go, no. How much is this on? Is there any billion-dollar contracts for any of this stuff? Oh, look at this, whatever. And so we haven't yet connected this into an end-to-end innovation pipeline whose clock speed matches the threats or our adversaries. That's the big point. We built these systems and components, DIU, I'll get to in a second, to match 20th century threats or non-nation state threats, which operated fine. But there's just a huge impedance mismatch between this and the outcomes we need. And it's not unfixable. It just requires somebody stepping all the way back and going, wait a minute, I got 3 million people here. I got a budget, approaching gosh knows how many hundreds of billions of dollars. Why am I not getting what I want at the other end? And why are our adversaries running in some areas, not many, but enough that matter, rings around us in the ability to field things? DIU, my opinion, in the last year or two under Kath Hicks and Doug Beck, is basically a slap in the face to the services that says, well, since you can't deploy this stuff and acquire it at speed, remember the services are the ones who are responsible for, coming up with weapon systems needs, and it's the combatant commands who get them. Well, Replicator is basically a way to say, well, so you haven't come up with what we need in the South China Sea, we're going to do it. Well, that's a little insane, but if you step back and then the rider programs out of Heidi Shyu and R&E, which Congress doesn't understand. Again, we've done a bad job of publicly educating those folks, are another attempt to kind of do this. And again, it's happened in the past where OSD is kind of, it's what Bill Perry did to kind of get the offset strategy, basically ignored the services and started building the things we needed.
All right, that is it for part one of our two-part series with Steve Blank. There was just way too much great content there with Steve to shove it all into a single episode. So please stay tuned. Later this week, we will be releasing part two. In our next episode, Steve and I are going to dive a little bit deeper into the future of defense technology investments. So we explore more ways to accelerate deployment of technologies into the Department of Defense, including cybersecurity technologies and unique ways of getting the critical capital needed for defense technology innovation to cross the chasm. We talk about SpaceX. We talk about the mismatch in venture capital. It's a really great episode. And that's our show, brought to you by N2K Cyberwire. Now, we would love to know what you think about this podcast, so your feedback really ensures we deliver the insights that keep you a step ahead in a rapidly changing world of cybersecurity. So if you like the show, please share a rating and review in your podcast app. It really does help others find the show. And also, please send an email to cyberwire@n2k.com with anything that you'd like to hear on the podcast. We are privileged that N2K Cyberwire is part of the daily routine of the most influential leaders and operators in both the public and private sector, from the Fortune 500 to many of the world's preeminent intelligence and law enforcement agencies. This episode was produced by Liz Stokes. We're mixed by Elliot Peltzman and Trey Hester, with original music by Elliot Peltzman. Our executive producer is Jennifer Iben. Simone Petrella is our president. Peter Kilpie is our publisher. And I'm Brandon Karpf, executive editor of N2K Cyberwire. Thanks for listening. How are you managing your organization's passwords and secrets? How can you enforce the security of all the passwords within your enterprise? Earlier, we talked about Keeper Security, but did you know that Keeper is much more than just a password manager? Keeper Security is a FedRAMP-authorized, zero-trust cybersecurity platform that seamlessly integrates enterprise password management, secrets management, and secure remote connections into one intuitive platform. Trusted by federal agencies, including the Departments of Justice and Energy, Keeper is the leader in zero-trust password and passkey management, secrets management, privileged access, secure remote access, and encrypted messaging. To schedule a demo or request a trial, visit keeper.io/gov. That's keeper.io/GOV. And our thanks once more to Keeper Security for making this episode possible.